Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. And today we're going to be talking about degree theory in astrology, and specifically anaretic degrees, but then also just talking about some other things you can consider with the degrees in your birth chart. And this is stemming from the fact that our last episode, the episode on Egyptian bounds, we recorded during a Mercury retrograde, and we started talking about anaretic degrees and just kind of didn't have all of our details together. So we're just coming back to do an episode about what anaretic degrees are. And um, so yeah, essentially anaretic degrees are a concept that exists more in modern astrology. It's not mentioned a lot in the traditional texts or in the more ancient Hellenistic techniques. And it's a
Mhm.
concept that the last few degrees of each sign are particularly difficult or destructive in one's life. Do you have more to add about kind of the concept of anaretic degrees with that, Lori?
Yeah, I think what I said in the last episode was that anaretic degrees were the final degree and the first degree,
Hmm.
which is not true. It's just the last degree or last few degrees. And that really, the word anaretic, stems from the Greek word, what is it?
For destroyer. So it's
Just
related
right,
to
the
like
word
a
for destroyer.
destructive destroyer energy.
Yeah, what is the Greek word? Did it say that?
So where I got this was from Michael Bryan's book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, which is a wonderful textbook. He's talking about the eighth house. So he's not even like when I went back to like
Yeah.
Demetra George's book and Chris Brennan's book, like there's not even like anaretic degree is not even in the index because it just doesn't show up in the ancient tradition. But when he's talking about anareta, he's talking about the eighth house and saying that the planet that rules the eighth house is called the Anareta, and Anareta comes from the ancient Greek word meaning destroyer. So I actually
Yeah.
don't even have what the actual Greek word is. We were just in
Oh,
Greece,
okay.
and the
Yeah.
alphabet for like whenever like the people who are learning Greek and especially ancient Greek and like doing the very specific translations are amazing like contributors to the tradition, and I
Yeah.
just can't read the alphabet. So I'm
Yeah.
just kind of
Fair.
relating from secondary texts.
Perfect. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, so the anaretic degrees kind of stem from bound theory because each last few degrees of every sign is the terms or the bounds are ruled by Mars or Saturn. So they are difficult, they're harder. And I almost like to think of them as like they're tired, like they've gone through the entire journey of the zodiac, of the sign that it was in, and now it's at the final few degrees, but there's like almost like a lot of pressure on them, that has built throughout traveling through that sign, and it's ready
Mhm.
to go. It's ready to get out of there. Whereas then 0 would be a critical degree, which is what I meant to say in the last episode.
Mhm.
And so a critical degree in that case is just saying like, okay, this is the first degree of a new sign. Um, and like another more modern astrology practice that I personally don't really like is when people call themselves a cusp sign.
Mhm.
Um, and I feel like that's a good leeway into that. Just real quick is like the word cusp is actually just the differentiation of the signs. Um, and so when you look at, hello, Leo, the planets, when they move or ingress from one sign to the next and move over the line of that's separating the houses, that's actually what the cusp is. So a planet is either in a sign or not in a sign.
Mhm.
So when a planet is at 29 or 0 degrees, they are two totally different things. And 0 degrees is more like the energy of the Fool, basically. Like it's a brand new beginning. It's like stepping into a new sign. It's excited, but it doesn't know where it's going. I like to think of a traveler going to a new country for the first time. Like it's stepping into this sign, but it like doesn't speak the language and it doesn't really know where it's going. Whereas that 29th degree is like, okay, I've seen this place. I'm ready to go to the next place.
Mhm.
Um, and then
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then like 15 degrees is often seen as a critical degree as well because it's kind of a halfway point. So you can argue there's like a check-in that is done at a halfway point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really beautifully said. And I think, yeah, talking about cusp theory is an important
Mhm.
conversation to have. And it's also, there's a million ways to practice astrology, and there's a million techniques and approaches, and none of them are right or wrong. And like, I'm sure there are a lot of really amazing astrologers out there that are working with like cusp theory as like you're a cusp baby if you're right between the signs. And there's just
Sure.
different ways to interpret it. So none of them are right or wrong. But Lori and I practice like traditional Hellenistic astrology for the most part, and then merge that with like mythic asteroids and some other pieces. But like we're
Yeah.
really grounded in the traditional, like in the tradition that stems back to ancient Greece and ancient Mesopotamia, even and ancient Egypt. And within the Hellenistic tradition, the each sign is very concretely divided. And so I always think of it as you're stepping from one room into another. So
Mhm.
like my Venus is at 28 Scorpio. And so she's at the end of one room. And right after I was born, she moved into Sagittarius. And it's almost like you step into a room and close the door. And especially when you get into aspect theory, planets that are in signs next to each other, like Lori's Venus in Pisces and Lori's moon in Aries, by
Mhm.
aspect theory, they can't see each other because, like, if you're sitting next to someone, like, and you can't turn your head, you can't see them. And even with like oracular theory, like the way the angle is within like a 30 degree or less angle, like it's hard to see it. So
Yeah.
it's like I have a bedroom right here, and it's like if my Venus in Scorpio is trying to talk to my Mars in Sagittarius, like maybe she can like do some braille on the wall or like some Morse code on the wall, but like they can't communicate because they're in
Yeah.
signs next to each other, and it is a very clear like you're moving from one room to the other. So
Yeah.
knowing like exactly which sign your planet is, it's like it's either Scorpio or it's Sagittarius based on traditional Hellenistic technique. Not to say that if
Sure.
you resonate with cusp theory and if that works well in your practice, like you're not right or wrong, but it's just not a technique that we use in our practices.
Yeah, and, just to add to that too, like, there are many degree theories in modern astrology too that kind of assigns a different meaning to each individual degree separately, and that's just, like, another thing you can look into if you're interested in that, but I don't I haven't found much, like, research to back any of those up. I've looked into them at certain points, but
Yeah. And then to
haven't found
just really
anything.
keep this like grounded in the Hellenistic technique,
Right.
that's where like the episode that we just did on what the Egyptian terms or the Egyptian bounds mean in astrology. If you haven't listened to that episode, it's linked down below, and we highly recommend you go listen to that because that's
Yeah.
really where the degree theory that we're talking about, like where we would find
Yes.
the roots in that, is that in a modern context, the last few degrees of a sign are anaretic degrees, and they're difficult. In a ancient traditional context, the scholars weren't talking about anaretic degrees, and you don't see that showing up in the tradition as much, but they were talking about Egyptian bounds. And as Lori
Yeah.
said, the end of each sign is ruled by either Mars or Saturn, so it has a more malefic, destructive energy. Whereas the beginning of each sign is ruled either by a benefic planet or Mercury, or else like Saturn in Libra in its sign of exaltation, or I believe Mars in Scorpio in its sign of domicile. So the beginning of each sign
Yeah.
is going to have a much more supportive bound leader and bound ruler
Mhm.
than the end of a sign. And that's where our degree theory is coming from, is using the Egyptian bounds.
Yeah, and I also, like, just to add a wide spread of things, there was a TikTok trend going around for a little while, that there was this joke like, "Are you a January Aquarius or are you a February Aquarius?" And they were making jokes about that, and that's actually a question I get a lot from clients or, like, even people who just come into my shop. They're always asking like, "Oh, what is the difference between a January or a February Aquarius?" And, I mean, nothing, but, your sun is either in Aquarius or it's not, but I think a lot of where that comes from can be looking at the bounds and the decans, and,
Mhm.
like, because, the different parts are going to have different energies, like, if you are a January Aquarius, then that means your sun is in the first decan, and the first one or two bounds of the sign of Aquarius. And so that's going to be a different energy than the middle decan and those middle bounds, or the final decan and the final bounds, which, as we just talked about, the final bounds are going to be the final bound is going to be ruled by a malefic. So that's another place you can look at for, like, when you hear jokes like that on the internet, that can be where that stems from.
Yeah, that's well said. Um, and then another thing just now, because we're talking about degrees, another thing that comes up with theory is that planets have exaltation degrees as well.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And this is a page from Wikipedia, and we cross-referenced it with Chris Brennan's book, and it's correct that each of the visible planets has, like, they have their sign of exaltation, which we did a whole episode on exalted planets, but then within that sign, there's a specific degree. So if your sun is at or near, I think it's exactly at 19 degrees Aries, and it's at its exaltation degree. And that's just like an extra oomph and an extra like support or strength.
Yes.
Looking at Chris Brennan's book on Hellenistic astrology, he says that typically the scholars are putting a lot more emphasis on a planet being in its sign of exaltation, no matter what degree it is, and that the exaltation degrees were not super prominent except for a few specific techniques. It's not something that I necessarily work with. It's like a lot to remember that, oh, the moon at 3 degrees Taurus is at her exaltation degree. It feels like more information than I really want to track. But
Yeah.
because we're talking about degrees in theory, it just feels like something that would be helpful to share here is, if you have your Jupiter at 15 Cancer, like that might feel particularly significant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then kind of the last thought, because Lori and I were just riffing about degrees, and kind of the last thought too is like, why do degrees even matter in astrology at all? Because I
Yeah.
feel like that's a place where you can start to really transition from more beginning astrology to becoming a little more advanced, is when you know like the actual degree of your ascendant and the actual degree of your planets. And the way I was taught it by Kelly Surtees is you can think of degrees of the zodiac as stair steps. So if my Mars is at 9 degrees Sagittarius and it's on this step, and right now transiting Venus is at 9 degrees Sagittarius. And so it's like Venus has stepped onto the same step as my Mars, and they're like locked in. They can really easily communicate. Like that's a really nice Venus transit to my Mars, that they're at the exact same degree. And so the entire time that Venus is in Sagittarius, she's activating my Mars, but it might like be most potent or significant when the actual degree is there. You can also look at like synastry. Like Lori and I both have
Mhm.
Venuses in late degrees of water signs. And so our Venuses are very closely trying together. Like Venus in Pisces is always going to have an affinity with Venus and Scorpio. But then because they're like so close in degree to each other, we're really good friends.
Mhm.
But looking at transits, synastry, aspects in your chart, if you have two planets that are at the same degree, that aspect is going to feel really, really potent. Whereas if they're in the same sign, that's still absolutely significant, but it might not be quite as strong. And especially when things are within 3 degrees is when they're the most significant. So it can just really help to like I'll talk about astrology as like a plug in a wall. And if you have certain things, like if I have this strong Sagittarius energy with my Mars and Jupiter and Sag, then when there's Sagittarius things happening, you can just plug that right into like my wall and it activates me. Like I don't need a converter, I don't need to change the voltage, like it just plugs right in. And so when things are at tight degrees, you can think of that as like you can easily plug into that energy. Whereas if the degrees aren't quite as precise to each other, you might need to like convert the voltage or convert the energy a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And that's how like horoscopes are written if you're not super familiar with how astrology works or where horoscopes come from or anything. They're going to look at the degree of your planet and then the degree of the transiting planets to decide if it's close enough. So when we talk about things being within, I know we talked about this a lot with the asteroids, but when it's within a 3 degree orb, or a 5 degree orb or an 8 degree orb or a 10 degree orb, like that's where that comes from. So things are going to be stronger when they're within that orb. Um, And then, kind of going back to the example that you gave with my moon and Venus, yes, they're in different signs. So by that account, they don't see each other, but they are within 8 degrees of each other, which most people would argue is a conjunction still. And if you think about like looking up into the night sky,
Mhm.
you would see the moon and Venus right next to each other. Um, and you can give the moon extra degrees because it moves so quickly um, for its orb conjunctions. And so, yeah, like you can make arguments for are things conjunct if they're at late degree of one sign and early degree of next sign, even though by
Mhm.
sign they would technically not, they would be blind spots to each other. They would technically not see each other. But by degree, maybe they are conjunct. And so, you
Mhm.
can include that in your interpretation or take that however way you choose to. Because how I see
Yeah.
it is like if you looked into the night sky, they're together.
Absolutely. And that's where, like, my point of there's a million ways to practice
Yeah,
astrology and none
it's
of
all
them are right or
nuanced.
wrong is like the theory when you're, because like Hellenistic astrology is very precise and like this is the theory and here's the rules and this and that. So the
Yeah,
theory, like, I think a lot of Hellenistic astrologers would say they do not work with out of sign conjunctions. Even if Lori's Venus was 29 Pisces and her moon was 0 Aries. It's like they're out of sign by the theory and the technique.
yeah,
They cannot see each other. But then, like the living sky, you go and you look at it right after Laurie's born, and you see the moon and Venus right there. That's significant, you know. So it's
right,
really just, and then it's Laurie's own life, right? Like, how do you feel in your life, and what does that
right,
mean for you? Like, there's no right or wrong way to go about that.
yeah, yeah,
And
and
one
I
other
think that's
thing.
where a lot of sorry.
No, you go. I was gonna change the subject, so go.
Oh, yeah, well, I was just gonna say, I think that's where a lot of the nuance of, like, taking the Hellenistic tradition, but then keeping in mind or keeping open-minded that there are a lot of modern ways to, like, retransition how things have been or, redefine or, like, there has been new research and we have
Mhm.
new planets now and, there's been a lot of discovery and there's been a lot of change since then, so I kind of see it as, like, it's all so nuanced and there's so many different ways of doing it, so, the traditional stuff, of course, still works, but if you find a nuanced piece that doesn't quite make sense, but there's a modern explanation for it, you can kind of adopt from different traditions, and kind of choose what you like in your practice too.
Yeah. Yeah, like this is a living tradition and it's just really exciting that we're in this time where so many ancient astrological doctrines have become
Yeah,
available in English and we can learn what these ancient theories are and I think it's important to really understand what the Hellenistic astrologers were doing and where they were coming from and then taking that and applying it to your client work to your own chart and seeing like were they right, were they wrong, like they all had like even the exaltation degrees, like different
right.
authors had different degrees, different authors had different bound degrees as well, and so we're taking this and we're bringing it and keeping it alive by applying it, which is just really exciting to me.
Yeah.
And then the other point I was going to make that's like should just be its own episode, but just to like do a little teaser here because we're talking about degrees
Yeah.
is like the concept of degrees, like the Greek word for that is zoe, which is like the zodiac, right? And zoe are living beings. And Kristen Mathis has done a lot of really amazing work connecting how the zoe of, and I might be pronouncing this wrong, but uh,
I
I
don't
don't
think you
speak
are.
Greek, but
Yeah.
the zoe of each, the each zodiacal degree, she connects them to the fates and how they're like
Mhm.
living beings in the sky. So if my ascendant's 28 Libra, like that little like degree of the sky is its own living and souled being that is then like its story is coming through me. And so there's this like animistic aliveness to the chart when you understand that like the Greek word for degree is the zoe and like the zodiac is the circle of animals, like it's all these living beings coming together in an ecosystem and interacting, and so like thinking of degrees as very alive and like what does it mean to be at like 19 degrees Aries for the sun versus another part of the sky and like what's the aliveness that comes through there is you know, like this is not just some mechanical, like we can take the living sky and we can draw it on a piece of paper and then take all of the life out of it and try to analyze it and have it be this like mathematical, mechanical, if this, then this thing. But really it's like it's speaking to our lives and our
Yeah,
relationships and our webs of relation. And so just thinking of the degrees as living beings, I think is a really exciting like invitation to interact with degree theory.
for sure. Yeah.
Okay. And then my
Cool.
last thing I think before we wrap up is I had like misquoted Demetra George in our last episode. And so I just want to clarify that when we had like been talking about anaretic degrees.
Yeah.
Um, because this is from Ancient Astrology and Theory and Practice, volume one. Sorry about my blur, but yeah, just amazing textbook. Everyone should have it. And this is
Mhm.
from her section talking about bound rulerships. It's on page 211. And she says a malefic planet bound lord would have strict and harsh rules, limiting the range of fortunate options and opportunities, or demanding unrealistically high standards of achievement with punishment for incompetency or failure. Um, and then she talks about oh my gosh, now I'm losing it. But I'm quoting this page specifically and her talking about the end of each zodiacal degree or
Yeah.
zodiacal sign and the way that the malefics rule it. And then I had written in my own notes anaretic degree. And so I thought that she talked about anaretic degrees when she was talking about the end of the sign, but she does not mention anaretic degrees in her work because, again, to my knowledge, the ancient astrologers weren't really talking about it. And so in the last episode, I had said that she mentioned anaretic degrees, and I just wanted to clarify that like that's actually not in the text. She's just talking about how the end of each sign is difficult because it has a malefic bound lord. So just to clarify that. And again, you can go to page 211 of her first volume of her ancient astrology books if you want more clarity for that.
Yeah. Amazing.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, I feel like we invoked the Mercury retrograde energy in this episode, even though Mercury is still not retrograde. So I hope you guys enjoyed those like 10,000 tidbits of different things to think about with degrees. And
Yeah.
yeah, we just appreciate everyone for like listening and let us know what you think about the concept of degrees being alive, or if you see like significance with working with different degrees or how degrees work for you. We really
Yeah.
love hearing from folks. And so like how this is landing with you or how you work with degrees is super interesting to us. And we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. If you ever want to send us a message or even just open the communication, we have an Instagram account, Conversations with the Planets. So yeah, feel free to reach out anytime.
Yeah. And yeah, do we want to just wrap up and you can share a little of what you have going on right now, Lori?
Sure. Yeah. So right now I've still just been putting a lot of focus into writing my book and still collecting examples. So again, I've actually had a few people reach out with their own stories, like email me with those. So that was great. If anybody else has any, please continue to do that. I'm also taking clients and doing readings. Um and yeah, I've been really trying to focus in on how the asteroids work for people. Um, I'm also hosting a lot of classes, especially in Cincinnati, but we're going to be launching a astrology school program. It's going to be 6 weeks in Cincinnati at my shop, but we're going to have an online option. So if anybody wants to tune in, um, feel free. Shoot me a message to join it. And we have an asteroid workshop that's going to be a Sunday night or Sunday afternoon, um, kind of just a one off, but it's going to kind of go with the program. If anybody wants to join in that. And otherwise, yeah, still been a little jet lagged from Greece, still like readjusting, but just been doing a lot of readings and Halloween's coming up and yeah, just taking on new projects. What about you, Alicia?
I am finally getting back into really working. I was just so deeply burnt out for months recovering from my surgery. And I actually really feel like taking time to rest was really important and very connected to my ethos because as an
Mm.
herbalist, I am trained in the vitalist tradition. And vitalism is very much about working with the body's vital life force and working with what is to enhance it and support it rather than like a lot of modern medicine. Like if you have a fever, you should just bring the fever down when like actually you want to cook out the infection. You just don't want to get so hot that you cook yourself, you know? So it's like the body's natural processes are very wise and very effective, and working with them rather than suppressing them is very much part of my ethos. And so, like, feeling really burnt out, feeling really exhausted, it's like we need to rest. Like, I could have just taken some adaptogenic herbs or like drank more coffee and like muscled through it. And that's kind of the modern approach to it. But like taking time to really deeply rest and let my like tissues recover, let my spirit recover, let everything just kind of recover from like the deep trauma of surgery uh is very just connected to my ethos. And I'm really grateful that I like had the space to do that. And now I'm just kind of
Yeah.
getting back into working and doing just a lot of back end stuff, working on clarifying my brand and my marketing strategy and all of that. But I, as always, offer astrology readings. I have written a lot of blog posts about different herbs, about ancestral veneration, about plant communication. And so my website's linked down below, and you can go access all these free resources I've put out. And if you'd like an astrology reading, or an herbal tea blend, my offerings are on my website as well. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I have going on.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see y'all soon.